Welcome to today's deep dive. We are really thrilled to have you joining us because today we're asking you to stretch your imagination to its absolute limits.
Yeah, we are tackling a concept that honestly genuinely breaks the human mental model.
It really does.
Yeah.
Human brains are just famously terrible at grasping truly massive numbers. I mean, if I ask you to imagine $1,000, you can easily picture, right? It's like a nice stack of hundreds, maybe a high-end smartphone.
Right, exactly.
And $1 million, well, that is a very nice house in a good neighborhood. But $1 trillion.
A trillion ceases to be money. It becomes pure abstraction. Our evolutionary wiring just didn't prepare us to calculate at that scale.
Yeah, think of it in terms of time. Like 1 million seconds is about 11 and a half days.
Okay.
1 billion seconds is over 31 years.
Wow.
But 1 trillion seconds, that is
Yeah.
31,700 years ago. We are literally talking about the Ice Age here. Neanderthals were still roaming around Europe 1 trillion seconds ago.
That's insane when you frame it like that.
Right. So when you start applying a word like trillion to a personal bank account, it honestly just feels like science fiction.
Yet mathematically, there actually is a clear calculated path to reach that number.
Yeah.
It just requires pushing the boundaries of biology and, well, finance, far beyond their normal breaking points.
Which brings us to the core of our discussion today.
Yeah.
We are looking at a highly entertaining yet deeply educational thought experiment published on May 14th, 2026. It's a piece by Jerry Bourne on his blog, The Millionaire Educator, and he writes this from his headquarters down in San Luis Potosi, Mexico. The post is titled, My Trillionaire Plan Revisited.
And we should clarify, our mission today is not actually to map out a realistic path for you to become a trillionaire. That massive number is really simply the hook to get us in the door.
Yeah, the real goal here is to decode the hidden, almost magical mechanics of compound interest over multi-decade timelines. We're going to walk you through 7 specific financial scenarios from this post. We want to see how slightly tweaking the variables of time and return rates changes the future by literal billions of dollars.
And by doing that, we kind of uncover the actual levers of wealth building that apply to anyone, whether your goal is, a million, a billion, or just enough to retire comfortably.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can project a trillion-dollar future, we really have to establish the present.
Right.
We need to look at the actual grounded starting line our author is working from. So Jerry is 62 years old. He is starting this experiment with a current portfolio value of $2.5 million.
Which is a very solid starting point.
Absolutely. And he notes this all started back in 2015 with an original post featured on rockstarfinance.com, giving a quick shout out to Jay Money there. But that original piece got lost in the cyber ether during a site migration to ghost.io.
Oh, it's a shame.
Yeah, but here's the most critical detail of this entire setup. His monthly addition to the portfolio. He's adding exactly $0.
And he's also withdrawing $0.
Right. He notes he lives off 2 pensions and a Social Security check. So the portfolio is just sitting there, 99% invested in Vanguard's BTI, which is, a broad total stock market index fund.
But I have to push back on this premise.
Okay, go for it.
It feels a bit like a sourdough starter, right? Can you really just stick a financial starter in the fridge, never feed it again, never add a single scoop of flour, and expect it to eventually bake enough bread to feed a small country?
It's a great analogy.
I mean, is a $0 addition actually a realistic way to model wealth building? Most financial advice is entirely centered around, aggressively adding to your savings.
Well, your skepticism makes total sense if we are talking about building an initial nest egg. But mathematically, setting the addition to 0 is precisely what makes this specific experiment so illuminating.
How so?
Think of it like a controlled laboratory setting. If you want to understand the true impact of a single variable, you really have to isolate it. If Jerry were adding, say, $50,000 a year to this portfolio, the waters would get incredibly muddy for the reader.
Ah, I see. You wouldn't know what was doing the actual work. Precisely. You wouldn't know if the massive future wealth was coming from the underlying power of compounding, or if it was just because he had a high income and was aggressively funneling new cash into the account. By stripping away the income generation by making the ongoing contributions 0, he isolates the pure variables of time and interest. The portfolio becomes a completely closed ecosystem.
So the only fuel allowed inside that ecosystem is the passage of time and the rate of return from the market.
Exactly, which allows you to see the raw, unfiltered power of compounding doing all the heavy lifting. Furthermore, Staying 99% invested in equities at age 62 is a massive assumption.
Yeah, it defies the usual rules.
Conventional wisdom says to shift to bonds to preserve capital. By staying entirely in the stock market, he is basically signaling that his time horizon isn't his own retirement. His time horizon is decades beyond his own life.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Now that we have this $2.5 million seed planted in this closed system, the author jumps straight to the most extreme future scenario.
Right, diving right into the deep end.
Exactly. We want to see if $1 trillion is mathematically possible on a spreadsheet and then immediately test how fragile that outcome really is. Let's look at scenario I.
This represents the absolute outer limits of optimism.
Yeah, scenario I assumes Jerry lives to be 140 years old. That is 78 more years of uninterrupted compounding. And he pairs that lifespan with an expected annual return of 18%.
Wow, 18%.
And the result in the year 2104 is over $1 trillion. Specifically, 1,010,966,066,478.
That is just a staggering number.
He even jokes about an AI picture he had Gemini generate of him at age 140 looking, quote, ancient, handsome, and loaded. He credits this theoretical future to a massive stock market bull run driven by artificial intelligence and advanced future tech.
We should probably pause on that 18% figure. Sustaining an 18% return for nearly 8 decades implies a radical, unprecedented transformation of global economics.
Like completely unheard of.
Yeah, I mean, Warren Buffett's career average is around 20%, and he is considered the greatest investor in modern history. Expecting the entire broad market to near that level for a century is, frankly, pure fantasy.
Which Jerry seems to know because he immediately follows it up with scenario 2. And this is the one that completely shattered my understanding of the math.
Oh yeah, the drop-off is wild.
For scenario 2, he drops his life expectancy by just 10 years, so living to 130 instead of 140, and he drops the expected return rate by just 2%, down from 18% to 16%.
Okay, sounds like a minor tweak.
Right, but the result in the year 2094 is just over $60 billion. Dropping the timeline by a mere 10 years and the interest by a tiny 2% wipes out 94% of his final wealth. He goes from $1 trillion down to $60 billion.
What's fascinating here is that you've just highlighted the extreme, back-weighted nature of compound interest. Our brains naturally think in linear terms. Like, if we cut the timeline by about 12%, we assume we should lose roughly 12% of the money.
Yeah, I always thought of it like running a marathon. But if compounding was a marathon, stopping at mile 24 means you'd still get credit for 90% of the race, right? But this is entirely different.
Yeah, let's use a better analogy for exponential growth. Imagine folding a standard piece of paper in half.
Okay.
If you fold it 42 times, the thickness of that paper will reach the moon. But if you stop at fold 40, just 2 folds shy of your goal, you don't just miss the moon by a little bit, you only make it a quarter of the way there. Compounding is an exponential curve that looks like a hockey stick.
So meaning the wealth generated in the final decade of a multi-decade compounding span is exponentially larger than all the previous decades combined.
Exactly. The vast, overwhelming majority of that $1 trillion wasn't made in the first 60 years of the experiment. It was generated entirely in those final 10 years between age 130 and 140.
That is just wild to think about.
And furthermore, that 2% drop in interest seems tiny on paper, but it acts as a massive mathematical drag effect. It means the base amount growing each year is slightly smaller, which means the next year's growth is smaller. Compound that drag over decades, and it represents a huge loss of momentum.
It really snowballs.
Right. When you simultaneously lower the interest rate and cut off the final 10 years, you are essentially cutting the fuse right before the bomb is supposed to explode.
Okay, so the math of $1 trillion relies on a lifespan that defies human history and a market run that defies all historical precedent.
Yeah, pretty much.
So what happens to this wealth when we constrain the experiment to the actual biological limits of the human body? The author scales down the numbers, bringing us out of science fiction and into biological reality.
We start moving into scenarios that, while still highly optimistic, are at least physically possible.
Right. So scenario 3 drops the age to 120, which gives the portfolio 58 more years of compounding. He pairs this with a 14% return. The result in 2084 is almost $5 billion.
Still an incredible amount of money.
Definitely. And Jerry notes here that 120 is just below the actual human world record of 122, which is held by Gene Culmet. From there, we move to scenario 5, living to 110 with a 12% return. That yields roughly $576 million in 2074.
Getting closer to Earth now.
Yep. And then we hit scenario V, living to 100 with a 10% return, resulting in about $93.5 million by 2064.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we really have to evaluate the realism of these return rates.
That is exactly what I want to ask you, because as a listener, at what point do these numbers actually start feeling tangible? I mean, reaching 100 years old is a real documented biological milestone, but looking at a sustained 12% or 14% return over half a century in a basic Vanguard ETF, is that just spreadsheet fantasy?
Well, when we look at historical market averages for broad indexes like the total stock market over 50-year periods, you rarely see a sustained 12% to 14% real return. It happens in shorter, decade-long bursts, certainly.
Right, like the 90s or the 2010s.
That's exactly. But over half a century, the market tends to revert to a mean. You have recessions, wars, and periods of high inflation that drag that average down. That's why Jerry's scenario V, the 10% return over the next 38 years, is where the thought experiment pivots from pure fantasy to actual possibility.
Yeah, he explicitly calls a 10% return, quote, not guaranteed, but not a crazy expectation.
Because it aligns much closer with the historical nominal returns of the U.S. stock market over very long durations. Historically, the S&P 500 has returned around 10% annually before inflation. It's a reflection of long-term corporate earnings growth and dividend reinvestment.
It is also worth pointing out Jerry's own commentary on his biological odds here. He jokes that his chances of hitting 100 might be impacted by the fact that he's, quote, not a vegan and unvaxxed.
Right.
Which, we're just impartially reporting his words there. He's candidly factoring his own personal lifestyle and medical choices directly into his longevity math.
Yeah, it adds a layer of grounded self-awareness to the spreadsheet. He knows he is playing with variables that are ultimately out of his control, including his own lifespan.
Which brings us to the moment the entire piece really shifts gears. We are redefining the concept of financial failure. We finally arrive at what the author considers his most realistic and ultimately his worst-case scenarios.
Right. The rubber meets the road.
Exactly. This is the moment the post transforms from a wild fantasy about beating Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos into a highly practical lesson about generational wealth and human psychology.
This is where the theoretical math meets human behavior.
Scenario 6 assumes he lives to age 90. That gives him 28 more years of compounding. He pairs that with an 8% return, which is historically very conservative for a pure equity portfolio.
Very reasonable.
And the result in the year 2054 is over $21.5 million. Jerry states this is actually his most likely outcome.
A highly grounded projection, all things considered.
Then we have scenario 7. This is his absolute worst-case scenario, both biologically and financially. Living to 80, which is just 18 more years, with a mere 6% return.
Okay.
The result in 2044 is still over $7.1 million. I just love the profound irony of this piece. It is the ultimate exercise in shooting for the moon, so that even if you miss, you land among the stars.
It really is.
I mean, his absolute worst-case scenario involves missing his primary goal by over $999 billion, and yet he still dies with over $7 million to leave to his heirs.
This raises an important question about how we frame our financial goals and the immense anxiety that surrounds them. There's a deep psychological brilliance to the structure of this exercise.
Yeah.
By anchoring his initial goal at an absurd, almost comical $1 trillion, he fundamentally tricks his brain into viewing $7 million or $21 million as a mere consolation prize.
It makes a multi-million-dollar fortune feel like a disappointment, which is hilarious but incredibly effective.
In normal circumstances, aiming for a $21 million retirement would feel incredibly stressful for the average investor. You would be agonizing over every single market dip. You'd be constantly logging into your brokerage account, terrified of failure, and you'd be tempted to move to cash during a panic.
Which is the exact behavior that destroys long-term compounding.
But by framing the narrative as a quest for a trillion, the realistic outcomes become a psychological safety net. It completely reframes financial anxiety into financial peace.
That's a great way to put it.
He literally writes in the post, wow, if this is financial failure, keep it coming. He knows his heirs will be perfectly fine regardless of market volatility. It's a cognitive trick. It allows him to stay invested, ignore the daily market noise, and let the compounding do its work without panicking.
So what does this all mean? When we look at all these scenarios side by side, from the 140-year-old trillionaire to the 80-year-old multimillionaire, the core takeaway is that the Trillionaire Plan is actually a clever Trojan horse.
Right.
The author doesn't truly expect to see $1 trillion in his account. He is using these extreme, eye-popping numbers to teach you a fundamental truth about wealth.
That time in the market is drastically more important than timing the market.
Exactly. The real heavy lifters of wealth aren't stock-picking genius, day trading, or even massive income streams. The heavy lifters are simply decades and percentages.
It serves as a masterclass in focusing on the variables we actually control. We cannot control if the broad market returns 6% or 18% over our lifetime, but we can control leaving the money alone.
Yeah.
We can control the N in the compound interest formula, the number of time periods, by starting as early as possible and avoiding the overwhelming temptation to interrupt the compounding process when the market gets rocky.
Which leaves you with a final, lingering idea to mull over as we wrap up today. This entire experiment assumed starting at age 62 with $2.5 million and adding $0. But what if you reversed the timeline?
Yeah, that is a phenomenal way to apply this to the listener's own life.
Right, because if time is the single most explosive variable in the math of compounding, how does that fundamentally change the true hidden value of a single dollar saved in your 20s compared to a dollar saved in your 60s?
It changes everything.
We established that the final decade of compounding creates more wealth than all previous decades combined. That means the dollars you invest earliest are the ones that get to ride that exponential hockey stick the furthest. A dollar saved at 25 has decades more runway to multiply than a dollar saved at 60.
It's powerful stuff.
So consider what your own scenario V6 looks like based on the seeds you're planting today. Because whether it's a million, a billion, or a trillion seconds, the math only works if you are patient enough to let the clock run. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.